We're going.
What's it like to launch a podcast during a global health crisis? And how does the show come together each day while the VPR staff practices social distancing in the age of COVID-19? This morning, we're going to find out. This is the Frequency Coffee Hour. We'll get answers to these questions and we'll answer your questions too. I'm Mary Engisch. Joining us are the Frequency's co-hosts, Henry Epp and Anna Van Dine. Welcome.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, hello.
And welcome to everyone who's watching us this morning too. As with so many organizations right now, virtual events are pretty new to us, and we appreciate that you're joining us this morning. And at the end of this event, we'll post a survey link in the comments on YouTube, and we'll appreciate it if you could just take a few minutes after we wrap up and let us know what you think. Now, let's get to it. First, we're going to flip the calendar back a few months to January of this year. Anna and Henry, we'd love to hear about, first of all, the inspiration and then the actual launching of the Frequency podcast. Anna, you first. I understand that this concept for a news podcast produced by VPR, that's been in the works for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's been an idea that people at VPR were kicking around for a while. And sort of my involvement with it started back in January when I was I was the wintern at VPR. I had been a summer intern. And then I came back for pretty much the month of January. And over the course of that month, we made a couple demo episodes of what this thing might sound like. And they weren't fantastic, but there was something about them that they seemed pretty, there was something there. And then I went back to school at the end of January. And then in March, I got hired to come back and help make this thing happen. So that's kind of when it actually started.
So there's like some basement tapes somewhere of like the early episodes.
There are, yeah.
Yes.
Bootleg tapes that we'll have to look for later. How did you jump in with both feet, or did you, like you're saying, you did some trial runs? What exactly did that entail?
There was a lot to figure out, like what we would want to do in terms of making what is broadcast news into a podcast format. So trying to figure out, what order things would go in, what things that are used for broadcast do and don't work in podcast format, maybe figuring out different kinds of wording or writing stuff, taking those longer feature stories and then sort of the shorter newscast things and saying like, okay, well, does it make sense to put this one first or this one first? How do we transition between them in a podcast instead of just sort of going from like one thing to the next? So that was kind of stuff that we were experimenting with different ways of doing that at the beginning. Some things worked better than others. And we figured out how to sort of go back and forth with the voices of two different hosts, which is not something that you hear on the air. And we just tried a bunch of different things, and some of them worked well and we kept doing them, and others didn't work so great, so we didn't do them again.
And Henry, how did you determine the tone and the feel of the podcast? Is it evolving? Did you land on a certain thing? And
Yeah, I mean, like Anna said, I think it is. It's definitely evolved, and it continues to. I think we're very open to, trying new things and, seeing what we want to do, kind of, day to day. Obviously, we've sort of landed in a rhythm, I think. And if you listen every day, you probably get a sense of that. But it's definitely evolving. I think in terms of the tone, the intention has always been to sound more casual than a broadcast, and it's hard to, we've talked about this internally, but it's hard to like exactly pinpoint what it is that feels and sounds different, and why it works better on a podcast than on a broadcast. but there is something there, and I think it has to do with the, with a broadcast, you are in a certain moment in time, and you're really tied to the clock, and I think there's just an expectation of a certain formality to that. As much as we try, that's also an evolving sound on VPR, I'd say. But like the podcast, it was sort of, we're just creating this thing kind of out of thin air, but pulling from our broadcast stories, and taking inspiration. There's obviously, we're not the first place to do a daily podcast that's become really popular in the last 4 years or so. So taking some inspiration from daily podcasts that already exist, which just sort of have a more casual tone, and some the banter between us, is something, like Anna said, that's not right, not typically found on public radio broadcasts, at least on like the local level. But yeah, so that's sort of all we've been trying to do.
Let's add in the fact that there was a global pandemic, and it seems literally overnight, people's appetites grew so rapidly for news. News was changing so quickly as well. How did getting the Frequency podcast together and out to our audience serve folks whose appetite for news just really blossomed overnight? Annie, you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think it was like at a moment where this whole project happened at a moment where so much was going on. Like I couldn't keep track of it all myself. And it was kind of a time where so many things were, like so many big things were happening, and so many small things were happening, that it was kind of overwhelming. And it was a point in time that seemed really important to be able to give people something that would sort of sum up what was happening, what they needed to know, but that also wouldn't require them to be like clicking through a ton of different things or like listening to a really long thing. It was sort of just like the most important things, that just made it a lot easier. I mean, it's something that I would listen to. It's a lot easier to sort of get to know what's going on, without being so inundated with everything that's going on. And that's something that seemed important to do at the time, and still is important to do. But I think that definitely was a good moment to start something like this, because it's different than what we've had before and what currently exists sort of in media in Vermont. It was something that people who live here and wanted to know what's going on here didn't have before. There wasn't something like it. And yeah, I think that's kind of why. I don't know if you have anything to add, Henry.
Yeah, I mean, I could, just peeling back some of the internal stuff here at VPR. Listeners probably noticed that we just really ramped up our coverage, starting around mid-March. Vermont Edition expanding to 2 hours a day. We had these live shows with Mitch Wertlieb, the sort of like call-in things that happened in like those initial first couple weeks of the pandemic. And it was just this, I mean, and, in the newsroom, everyone stepped up in just an incredible way and have continued to in the last, however long it's been, 3 months or 4 months. But, I like, so a big part of my job hosting All Things Considered is doing the newscasts in the show and sort of keeping track of what's going on, because a lot of stuff comes in the afternoon. And typically before the pandemic, we'd have like, 4 or 5 different individual items, we call them bites or wraps, that come in from reporters. And suddenly in mid-March, it was like, that's a typical afternoon. And it was like 20. It was like 20. It was, it quadrupled in terms of the output from the newsroom. So from from starting the podcast, we had suddenly so much material to work with. And kind of the great thing was that we had a lot to cover, but we also had a lot to work with in terms of what we were putting out as a newsroom. And I think in some ways that made it maybe a little bit easier than if we were to have started it in a really like slow news time. And that sort of gave us the jump of like, okay, we're just getting this is another way to get information to people every day, and get people caught up, and that we're curating more than like trying to piece something together with only like little bits of news. It's really like, okay, here is what people should know right now today about this pandemic and everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, and like it didn't happen because of the pandemic or because of everything that's going on, but it was the right time to do something like that.
Here's a question for both of you. If we're looking over your shoulder right now, what would we see in terms of the actual physical putting the frequency together? Can you sort of share what your daily timelines involve? And if you've got some screenshots of scripts and editing and things like that, that'd be cool to see that too.
Totally.
Yeah.
Do you want to start, Henry?
Sure. Well, so the first thing to know is that we make the episode the day before. So they come out early in the morning, but it all comes together mostly in the mid-afternoon the day before. It is finalized by like, I don't know, what, 7 p.m. usually.
Sometime between 5 and 7.
Yeah. And that's sort of something we've also been, we sort of debated early on is like, should this come out in the evening? Should this come out in the morning? We eventually decided to do it in the morning. Often like news doesn't change in a huge way overnight in Vermont. But so basically what the day looks like is around now, we start thinking about what is going to be in the next day's show. And that usually depends on what we're also planning to air on broadcast. So typically, our executive producer, Mark, who you hear in the credits, will know what the feature lined up from a reporter is the next day. Often I've had what we call two-ways interviews that air on All Things Considered. That's kind of been the main, those are like the go-tos for our longer pieces. So we identify what those longer pieces you hear are going to be, and then so that's how we start. And then midday we start thinking about, or start trying to figure out what's going to be in that newscast section, like the top sort of headlines section at the top, and that's also informed by what's coming in from reporters or what's happening that day. Often like the governor's press conferences that have been happening feed that a lot. So yeah, around 2 p.m. or so. Well, Anna, you start the script usually in a Google Doc.
Yep, make a Google Doc, and then it gets very exciting at 2 p.m., which is when Henry, you, Mark, and I all jump on the Google Doc together and start writing and rewriting stuff and moving stuff around, and sort of it's really funny to see like all of our cursors on there, just sort of negotiating what it's going to be like and sort of all writing it together. Like by the end, I don't know who's written what, but it all works. And I can show, I have a screenshot of what this whole process looks like, and I'll share my screen with you guys so you can see that. Because it gets pretty crazy, I have to say. Okay.
All right, can we see that?
Yeah, almost.
Yeah, there
it
is.
Wow.
So
colorful.
Yeah. So like if you use Google Docs, like if you have multiple people in them, I don't know how they assign the colors, but each person is a different color if you're in the suggesting mode. And so we're like, this is each of us like deleting stuff or writing new stuff. And this is us just trying to write like the introduction.
Yeah. And sometimes we'll get hung up on something and we'll spend like 10 minutes trying to do one sentence and we'll be like, whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to realize too that so much of broadcast radio is about timing and time and length of things and hitting posts and making sure. And this just feels like, so much not a free-for-all in a sense that you can have an episode go on. But do you feel that there is a bit more freedom in terms of, the length of the podcast? What is the average length of the frequency when it comes out? Do you kind of try to stick to that, or is it different every day?
It's been changing. It's continued to change, actually. I'd say even the last couple of weeks, we've had some episodes that are on the shorter side, like under 10 minutes, which, Anna, right? I mean, the early ones, we were almost never under 10.
Yeah, earlier we were like around 15, sometimes closer to 20, not usually under 12. But lately, like the other day, we had one that was under 8, actually, just under 8. It was pretty good, I thought. So it's cool to experiment with the different lengths and to see like what it's like to put in just like one feature story, or depending on how long that is, or what the content of that is, or how things fit together or don't fit together, sort of figuring out what sort of that package can be like.
Are you able to get feedback in real time from your audience? How is that? How are you collecting, information from the folks who are listening?
We don't really get feedback in real time. I would love to hear more feedback from the audience in terms of what people like and don't like. We have this email address that we've gotten some emails from listeners, which is awesome. People have been really positive, which is great. But I think we'd always love to hear more from people. I think you can also, if you use like the Apple Podcasts app, you can review us. We've gotten a lot of 5-star reviews, which is great. I am very much open though to constructive criticism. Yeah, would love to hear more of that. And I think it's also evolving, in terms of how much we put ourselves in the show, I guess. Right. I mean, at a certain point, we sort of decided it was okay to we had sort of been leaving these little outtakes at the end. And Anna, this was all you because you mixed the podcast, but at a certain point, we just decided to leave them in the middle of the, so I mess something up, and we just left it in and sort of, I don't know. I kind of like that in an aesthetic way. I don't know.
Yeah,
it feels more natural to what we're actually doing.
Yeah, I started doing that because of something that Erica Heilman said to me. And it's been something that I've been experimenting with more as I will put the podcast together. Because we do have these funny little moments often, like in today's episode. I left in the part where I was like, I don't know how to transition from this thing to this thing, but here we go. And that was just real. So it was cool to leave that in instead of just sort of cutting that out and making it more abrupt. And I think it's nice to leave in that where people listening can hear us having a good time recording this thing, because sometimes we'll make each other laugh sometimes, or weird things will happen, or there'll be minor disasters, and that's just the way that things are. That's real life. And it's neat that we have a place that we're able to keep some of that stuff.
And I think that's where the broadcast, or the lack of a broadcast clock, comes into. Mary, of course, you said, and you were so got to keep on the clock, and there is just not room to mess around in that way. And I hope I don't want it to sound too self-indulgent. Also, that's my fear, but there's also not the pressure to okay, we got to keep this really tight, but also we don't want to waste people's time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, the landscape is big enough and the space is wide enough for people to consume news in so many different ways now, whether it's that more regimented news feel that they're used to on, say, All Things Considered, which you host, Henry, or something a little bit more, a little bit more relaxed, like the Frequency podcast. Oh, I also want to mention too that if folks do want to reach out to you, your email is thefrequency@vpr.org. Henry, let's talk a little bit more about that. You do host All Things Considered on weeknights here on VPR. Where do you see the Venn diagram? Is there the little space in between where these news resources sort of cross paths, and where do they diverge?
I think the crossover is actually pretty big in a lot of ways. I mean, we are really pulling from the same material for the most part for the podcast and All Things Considered, both in terms of the newscasts and headlines and also the features. I mean, literally, like if we play a feature straight through on the podcast, you're probably going to hear that on All Things Considered as well. I think the difference, in some ways, like we've been talking about, is the presentation, being a little bit more casual. And also something we've started to do on the podcast is sometimes take a feature from a reporter and essentially do it ourselves or put our voices on it, and do some rewriting and sort of make it this continuous piece, taking all the elements of that feature and putting it into the podcast form. So that's something that's very different than All Things Considered. I think I've noticed that doing the podcast has sort of informed my hosting on ATC, in part because, and this is we didn't mention, but a big part of doing the podcast is we record over Zoom, like a Zoom call like this, and we're just each recording ourselves around 3 p.m. Sometimes like 3:15 or 3:20, which makes for a really tight time frame for me to get on the air at 4 o'clock. But so like a lot of times I'm literally, like we end our Zoom call and within, 15 or 20 minutes, I'm on the air doing ATC. So like I'm in that headspace of the podcast. And so I think that's bled over into how I sound on ATC maybe a little bit, which I think is a good thing. I don't know what else I can say about the difference here, but yeah, I think sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I'd love to also ask you both about how, where do you consume your own news during the day, and how does that kind of shape the way that you're putting the podcast together? Like, are you listening to other news podcasts or even not news podcasts and sort of borrowing some elements from that and, creating the frequency that way?
I guess I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Where I'm getting like my news during the day. I mean, I don't know. I'm reading the Washington Post, New York Times. Like I have their homepages up, open in tabs. I don't know, looking at NPR, seeing what's going on Twitter, all that kind of stuff. In terms of like podcast listening for news podcasts, I'm not a regular religious listener to news podcasts, but I'm familiar with and enjoy stuff like Up First, Post Reports, things like that, The Daily, and those are all like kind of larger things. They're more national, so they don't totally, I don't think I'm modeling off of what they're doing, because what we're doing is so different. But I'll think about like how something like The Frequency has sort of more like a local flavor and character in comparison to something that's more national like that. But there's also like little things that I'll think about in terms of like presenting stories, or how hosts are talking to each other on a podcast, or talking to the people that they have on, or the reporters, things like that. I feel like everything that I listen to or read or experience is informative in some way, when I'm thinking about what I'm doing, in terms of The Frequency, or really any other kind of work. Yeah, I don't know about you, Henry.
Yeah, I'd say pretty similar. In terms of national news, New York Times, Washington Post mostly, and NPR, is a huge part. I get 2.5 hours of NPR national, international news every day, every afternoon. And I also listen to Morning Edition for usually about an hour every morning, and Marketplace and the BBC. I've actually I have not been listening to that many podcasts recently. In the past I have. I listened to The Daily a lot, especially early on when it started. And I've gone in and out recently. But sometimes, Up First. And I've been listening to podcasts for a long time now, and things that are not news. Some like comedy podcasts, which I've this show Comedy Bang Bang I used to listen to for a very long time. I haven't listened to it in quite a while, but so I think that's always sort of informed my, I don't know, sensibility around radio, even though have felt very separate from that world. So I think the fun thing about doing the frequency is there's like a little bit more of an opportunity to tap into some of the, I don't know, goofier sensibilities that I spend my free time consuming. So.
Right. Tell us about a memorable story that you've worked on for the frequency.
Anna, do you have one?
I mean, I remember all of them, but I think memorable stuff. I mean, there was a feature story that I did that was for broadcast as well, that where I had or an EMT, an EMS worker, kept an audio diary that I sort of edited down and put together, and that was sort of like when things in the pandemic here in Vermont were settling down a bit, but just sort of like what his experience had been like over the past few months doing his job. And I think out of what I've done since being at BPR as a full-time employee, which has not been that long, I think that's sort of one that it definitely has been sticking with me because it was something that didn't have narration, which was fun to do. I really love doing those kinds of stories. And it was also something that came directly from like a person. It wasn't me going, like there wasn't an interview involved. He just sort of recorded himself. So that was something that I really, really liked to do.
Yeah, I'd say for me, in terms of stories I've been on the frequency, I'd probably I was just last week, this farmer up in Alberg on the border, Roger Rainville. I went up and talked to him a couple weeks ago. I guess it was like in late May, just about his life on the border and what he's seen in terms of changes while it's been closed, and his life as a dairy farmer. He was just this great guy, and just the kind of person I barely had to ask a question when I got there, and he just sort of like launched into his life and into just the kind of person that you just want to keep hearing him talk, and so that was really fun, and I felt really good about that piece. The first honestly, I mean, some of the interviews and stuff that I did that were in the first like month or two of the podcast is a little bit of a blur because it was just like the thick of the pandemic, and a lot of those were done like over Zoom, and I think there's something about doing it. Not that there were a lot of good interviews, but some of those they don't. Partly because it's just been so busy, but not going to see someone in person, I feel like really changes, at least for me, like whether it's memorable or not. You know what I mean? And whether it sort of sticks with you, and being like in Roger Rainville's field with him and in his barn, and the smells and the sounds and everything is a lot different than seeing someone over Zoom, which unfortunately has been how we've had to do a lot of things recently, but I think we've done great interviews and great work.
Right.
That actually, Henry, that reminds me, all those Zoom interviews that you were doing, I guess another answer to your question, Mary, is one thing that I really liked that we did in the podcast was when there was stuff going on with the Vermont State Colleges system, and Henry talked to Jeb Spalding like three times. And we sort of used that as a way to talk about what was going on in a totally different way in the podcast. So, we heard, if you were listening to All Things Considered, you heard each of those interviews, but then in the podcast, we could say like, oh, like this is what's going on now, but then also you talked to him a few weeks ago, and then you also talked to him 2 years ago, and so here's some more like temporal context for what's going on. Here's what's been happening in more of a longer term, and that's not something that you or that we tend to do in stuff that you hear sort of in like the daily news cycle. But that was a really cool thing that we were able to do in the podcast, was to sort of draw it out in a different way, or to look at it in a different way, and to play with some of the older tape, the older stuff that we had recorded and archived. So that was neat.
I love that just putting a fine point on that concept of it. It's almost like a web post that comes to life. So all the tags and all the links to all the other stories that perhaps you have done, it all is now part of the audio from the podcast on the frequency. That's really cool. Just a quick reminder that folks who are watching, we'd love to have some feedback from you too. So afterwards, we're gonna share in the chat, you can share your comments on YouTube here. So I'm Mary Engisch. We are talking with Henry Epp and Anna Van Dine. They are the co-hosts of The Frequency. Both Anna and Henry, you're from other parts of the United States, I'm guessing. And I'm not guessing, I'm pretty sure of that.
Not Anna.
Not Anna. No, Henry, you're from Minneapolis.
Minneapolis.
I'm wondering if, and Anna too, if being from Vermont too, any stories that you've covered that are hyper local, like Henry, you're talking about going to visit the farmer up on the Canadian border, have they helped shape or change your concept and knowledge about Vermont, about Vermonters?
Yeah, Anna, I'd say yes, absolutely, for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really interesting for me because I grew up here. I was born here, raised here, and then I went away for school. So I was gone for 4 years, and then I came back, but with a different perspective. You know, having been outside of the place where you grew up, you start seeing it differently. You remember it differently, and you know, as time passes, things change. And then to come back sort of with that different perspective, I guess like more of an understanding of like an outside perspective, to have that, and then to also be thinking about telling stories about this place, and how to bring people voices that will make them think differently about the things that they already think that they know. Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting to sort of examine the place, a place like this. That, I mean, I love Vermont a lot, and there's parts of it that are great. There are some parts of it that are less great, and I mean, I don't know. I just feel like I learn so much about this place every time I do a story or I hear a story that somebody else did. And there's always, it just always becomes more and more complicated. And I think that's a good thing. And I like to be able to complicate those stories and narratives as well with what I do.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think I just, I would say growing up, I don't know if I could have pointed to Vermont on a map. I knew it was one of the small states up in the corner of the right-hand corner of the map. But yeah, I think just, my only journalistic experience has been reporting on a place sort of as an outsider. Before I was here, I was in Western Massachusetts where I went to college. And, in both situations, it's sort of been coming into a place and really learning about it by and through reporting and interviewing people, and just continually gaining more understanding of the history and the present and all the different issues and more nuance. I think I definitely, when I came up here to Vermont like 3 years ago, I had some understanding of what the state was like, but it's just continued to every interview, I think, just informs, what a place is actually like, what the people here are like, it just continually, like Anna said, gets more complicated in a good way.
Complicated in a good way.
Yeah.
Are there stories or topics or issues that are central to Vermont that are untold that you think, and you can't wait to kind of digging into those, exploring those, and sharing them?
I mean, there definitely are. There are tons of
Yes.
stories that are untold and are out there.
Name one, each of you.
Um,
I think off the top of my head.
I can't think of a specific story, but I think definitely, like, in terms of groups and voices that I want to hear from more, I want to speak to more. I'm definitely most interested in young people and old people. You know, I love when you're listening to the radio or a podcast or something and you hear the voices of like kids or teenagers. I think that's great. And I also think that I love talking to people who are older than me and know things because they've lived a little bit longer than I have. And I think that kind of the wisdom of just like lived experience is something that I also I just enjoy speaking with older people, and I think that it's cool when I'm able to bring those voices to other people who might not, who otherwise wouldn't have heard them or what they have to say.
Yeah.
I have a question here from someone who's watching. Kelsey says, I like the wildlife stories. Any chance of a spin-off podcast? Maybe the frequency, flora, and fauna.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe it's like a minute-long separate podcast feed.
Just the sound of tree frogs in the
Yeah,
background.
I think we definitely do. I mean, we have talked about including more wildlife sounds in the podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
definitely. Mark, our executive producer, is a fan of the wildlife sounds, and I'm really with him on that. So,
Anna, can I just tell like the backstory of why we do so many of those a little bit?
yeah.
So Anna was a summer intern last year in the newsroom, and did a ton of what we call bites, to feed the newscast. And it was the summer, and there was not a pandemic, so the news was often slower than it is right now. And so I don't know when it became a thing or why, but Mark would just assign every single Fish and Wildlife press release to Anna, like, I don't know, whatever. And there, it's important information, like don't feed the deer or whatever it is. But they're sort of, it's not. Well, I don't know. It's not the newsiest of
breaking news.
It's not breaking. Yes,
Yeah.
It's not breaking news.
Yeah.
But whatever. It became this thing that Anna got assigned every Fish and Wildlife story, and then that just transferred to the podcast. That at some point he just started writing, like including them in every time, and then Anna and assigning it to Anna to read them. And telling me, the like city dweller, that about this wildlife happening.
Right. It's tick season and/or trout season. And
yes.
That's important stuff. That's true. I actually love. Yeah, those are some of my favorites too. I love that.
I've learned a lot.
Yeah. Sort of grounding and centering to kind of bring it all back to wildlife. Just a couple more questions. This is, mostly something that I'd love to know, and if you guys can share it too, is really, can you share what makes you tick? Like, you wake up in the morning, are you, open to all the joy and abundance in the universe and ready to take on another day? Just bring us inside, if you can. Just what makes you tick?
I don't know if I start the day open with joy and abundance. After some coffee, I more in that headspace.
Yeah.
I think, and I think this time, of the pandemic and everything that's been happening has just sort of doubled down for me the desire to work really hard here at VPR and try to, approach every day trying to tell the stories that are happening here in this really extraordinary time, and to like just kind of dig into doing good journalism. I think I've always felt that as long as I've worked in this field, but I think the last couple months have just sort of brought that to a new level of like, let's go. There's a lot going on. Let's get out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have like a list of things I think about a lot. Like something that a producer that I spoke to at a place where I was interning once upon a time. She told me that the reason why she does anything, that the reason that she makes audio stories is to try and help make people feel less alone. And that's something that I think about a lot. And I think that's something that I try to do as well, or is always kind of in the back of my mind. Also, I think like really essential for me is just like figuring out ways to encourage people to listen to one another, not just listening to the things that they hear in a podcast or hear on the radio, but to take that and to be inspired to listen to people in their own lives and to ask each other more questions, to get to know one another better. I don't know. Those are the sort of things that I think about a lot. And also just like encouraging more curiosity and, like non-judgmental curiosity about the world around you and the people around you. I think that's something that we can all always get better at. I know that I can. And yeah, I don't know, just encouraging those things that remind us that we're human, and reminding each other that we are human, and that we're there to listen to each other and talk to each other. Yeah, that's kind of what's been on my mind, especially right now as we're sort of all in this strange, isolated state, or there's a pandemic going on, and it's a very strange world, and I don't know. So all the things that we can do to help each other feel less alone and to listen to one another more is, I think, extra important.
One last thing, where we started thinking back a few months toward January, when you were just starting to create some prototypes of the podcast, kind of pre-pandemic. If we think back to the beginning of 2020, and you could talk to yourself now, what one sentence would you dash off in a text that you could receive today about the state of the world, or about creating the Frequency podcast for VPR?
Rest up. It's gonna be a busy year. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I might say that, but I think, be ready to go into this year with a lot of, and this is sort of a thing that I try to bring to interviews, but both empathy and curiosity. Okay, three things: empathy and curiosity and skepticism in differing shares, depending on whatever story it is you're doing. But I think all those sort of tenets have been really important. I think they always are in journalism, but just in a time like this, I think keeping those things in mind has been really important to me.
For me, gosh, I don't know. I mean, like thinking about all the movements that are going on around the country right now, I think that, I don't know, some sort of hint to myself about how the deep inequities of our society are becoming more apparent, but they've always been there. And there are other things, and there are other issues and problems and things like that are also there, but are sort of untold stories still. I don't know if I'm totally answering the question, but I think that more what I'm saying is that sort of learning from that is that there's always something more to look for, and there's always something more to listen for and to pay attention to, that might not be clear yet, but might become clear in some way, just because that's kind of what we've seen happen. And I think there are a lot of other stories like that that have not been made apparent yet, and that there's kind of work to be done there.
We have another question from someone who's watching, and Katie asks, do either of you have a phrase that you find yourself using a lot? And she says, I'm thinking about how you've talked about the spigot. Do either of you have a spigot that you've noticed, or do your coworkers have a spigot?
Oh man, I feel like we definitely do. What do we, Hannah, do you have something off the top of your head?
I have like a catchphrase or anything like that. I know that I say I don't know a lot. I think that's my thing when I lose the end of my sentence or like my thought or something like that. I'll just be like, just stop talking and be like, I don't know. And that's something that I'll notice when I'm sort of editing the podcast as well. I'll be like, going back through sort of my tracks, my part of the recording, and I'll be like, oh, you say that a lot. Things like that, but I don't think I have anything exciting or quirky.
You'll have to come up with a catchphrase for the end of the podcast. Henry, can you think of any?
I don't know. Well, in the way that Anna says, I don't know. I say sorry a lot as just a tick. I like all the time, and I've been noticing myself doing it and trying to do it less, actually.
Apologize less. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know. We also, I feel like we have some like phrases within. Well, there's one word we've used when we. I think it's okay to say this. Like when we've taken people's stories, like features, and put them into our own words. We've called that the carcass treatment.
Yeah, that's that's part of our secret frequency vocabulary.
No, it's not secret.
And why not so secret? Let's tear that apart a little more. Why would
well,
it
there you go. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know why that. I'm going to blame Mark Davis for that one.
It sounds fish and wildlife related, so maybe that's
it does. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Just taking the thing and picking it apart.
Yeah. So you're talking
like
about
the vultures we are on the frequency podcast.
So you're referring to, let's say, a recorded piece from Peter Hirschfeld.
Yes.
Yeah, for a story for a previous day, and you and Anna are dismantling it and retelling it. Sort of, is that kind of what you're referring to?
That's right. Yes.
Just want to make sure here.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to chat about that we haven't asked you about yet in terms of the frequency and the creation of it, or just jump in?
Well, I mean, I can show people what it looks like when I edit things together, because sort of what happens during the day is we'll have our Google Doc scripting, and then Henry and I will record, and he'll go off to host All Things Considered, and then I will chop things up and put them together. So if anything sounds weird ever, it's my fault. But I can show you what that looks like, because that's kind of a cool behind the scenes thing.
Had you done much editing, audio editing before, Anna? I know you were interning in the newsroom. How much hands-on audio editing were you doing then?
A fair amount. I would mix my own stories.
But before you were an intern, you'd done a lot, right?
I'd done yeah. I mean, I'd been an intern at a few places. I'd helped produce a podcast. I'd done stuff at StoryCorps. I did a lot of stuff at my college radio station. So yeah, I mean, I kind of taught myself how to edit audio, and then I learned more through some internships and stuff that I did. There's still more to learn. There are lots of like little tricks you can do. But yeah, that's where I'm coming from with that. But I can show you what this looks like. So this is the episode from June 9th. And so this is actually when we redid a carcass of a story. So this up here is my voice. This is what my voice looks like in waveform. This is what Henry's voice looks like. And then we have down here, we have all the different little pieces of audio that we were adding in. And then we have this piece that Jane did in that episode. There's some music down here. And this is kind of what it looks like. Yeah, I like that all the tracks are different colors. I always make myself green and Henry purple and the news yellow. It's just how it is.
I love it. This can go for either of you too. Was there like a professor or a mentor who really kicked off your passion for news, for public radio?
Yes, I can point to a specific person who, I mean, without whom I don't think have pursued a career in public radio, and that's my professor at Hampshire College. Her name's Becky Miller, and she taught a radio. It was called Music Journalism for Radio, and I took it in the spring of my third year in college, and I was not specifically studying journalism at the time, but it was sort of this combination of a lot of different interests, and it like came together in a really great way. And she was really the person who said, hey, you're doing a good job at this in this class, and you should try to get an internship at the local public radio station the following year. And like that led to me getting a job. So it was absolutely Becky Miller. So thanks, Becky.
Yay, teachers.
Yeah.
Anna, how about you?
For me, I feel like it's a longer story with more little pieces. I think like the beginning of my interest in stuff like this was when I was in, I mean, maybe like 8th grade when Hurricane Irene came through Vermont, and my community was hit pretty hard. And the Folk Life Center came in and did a lot of story workshops with us, and we made a documentary, and we did interviews with people. And that's kind of the first time I remember doing something like that. And then sort of at the end of high school, there was another class that was similar where we did some stuff with the Folk Life Center. We did a little bit of interviewing, recording, that kind of thing. And sort of like, I mean, the whole time I was a kid, there were 2 jobs that I wanted to do. One of them was to be a teacher. The other one would have been to like drive around the country and record the stories of old people, which I didn't realize was a job, but I guess like you can be an oral historian, and that is something you can do. But I, at some point, realized that doing like radio stuff was kind of doing both of those. And that's kind of, I guess that was kind of at the end of high school. And then sort of throughout college, I did different classes and internships and things that taught me different things about how to do it, what to do, how to get better at it. And here I am.
If I could just
sorry. Go ahead, Henry.
I would be remiss to not mention my mom also, who worked in public radio when I was a kid and had her own radio show, and I was surrounded by that growing up, and so is absolutely the root of me being in public radio. So thanks, Mom.
In your DNA.
Yes.
Rick wants to know what editing software you're using, Anna.
That is Adobe Audition, which I like because I like that it makes them different colors, but I also like it. There's some like little things in there that you can do like you can, I mean, this is a different world, but like you can like look at the spectrogram of something and you can like take out different layers of sound or like different noises really easily. That sort of thing. It's also just very user friendly, which I like. It's yeah, it's a nice like middle of the road kind of thing.
You've also used it, right? There's all this like metadata that has to go into a podcast episode, the sort of like text that goes along with a piece of audio that goes out as a podcast, and you're able to do that in Audition, right?
Yeah. That's actually a separate interest of mine. I think like metadata and like copyright law are really fascinating. It's a conversation for another time, but that's the thing that we do with the podcast, is we have to tag it with metadata to like sort of attach to the audio file itself, like the name of the episode, the copyright that says Vermont Public Radio 2020, and just like the name of the podcast. So that will sort of always follow the audio file wherever it gets uploaded, so that it's always clear kind of what it is, where it came from.
And what's that metadata used on the other end? Is that used to capture listenership, or what is exactly happening with the metadata in the background?
I have no idea.
That would be that would be a question for Noah via Marine Cutter,
Yeah.
or one of our digital
Yours
folks.
digital people.
Yeah. No, I do think it definitely does have something to do with the podcast feed, though, sort of like how it's read by that, and just also so that information is always with the file.
One more question. If you had to name your interview style, both of you, what might you call it? What might you name it?
Oh man, I don't know. Oh, you stumped me.
My interview style is called Stump the Interviewee.
I'll call it Gary. I don't know.
The G stands for the
The
A.
G stands for. Oh man, no, I don't know. I feel like I have two interview styles. This is not an answer to the question, and I don't know what I would call it. But I have the interview style of when I know that I'm not on mic, and when I am on mic. Or so if I do an interview for All Things Considered or for the podcast, and you hear me asking the questions, I often take a very different approach than if I'm doing a story for, say, a feature where I'm only going to use clips of the interviewee and you're not going to hear my voice at all. And the difference is I sound a lot more polished and think a lot more about, which is a good and bad thing about how I'm sounding, asking the questions, versus when I do an interview. And I've talked to other journalists, like print reporters, who've talked about this, of like listening back to their own interviews and the questions that to eventually get to the question that you're asking a person in the setting where you're not on tape, can sound very rambling and very like. So I think those are two different personas, and so maybe Gary is the more disheveled version.
How about you, Anna? Do you have a style, interview-wise?
I mean, that's a hard question for me because I don't know. I feel like I'm still like learning so much how to interview people. Like every interview, I learn so much, and like listening back to something that I like an interview that I've done is just like really informative. But I don't know. I guess like a couple of things that I always try to do is to not assume that I know anything. Even if I think I know it, I tell myself that I don't, and I act like I don't, because often what I think I know is not actually what there is to know, or there might be more there. And also, I don't know, to the extent that it's possible and appropriate, just like to be gentle. I think not necessarily when talking to like a public official. I mean, even then to be gentle, but to, I don't know, to always think about what you're asking of somebody else, and what, there's a lot of trust that's involved when you're interviewing somebody, just like in being mindful of that.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are gonna wrap up this first ever virtual coffee hour with the hosts of The Frequency, Anna Van Dyne and Henry Epp. Thank you so much for letting us in on the process and the frequency itself. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mary, and
Thank
thanks everyone for
you.
watching.
And also, we're gonna put a link at the bottom of this so that you can put your comments there on YouTube. We'd really appreciate it if you could just take a few minutes. We're gonna, after we wrap up here, and let us know what you think. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks.